March 9, 1945, 11:47 p.m. Tokyo. The air raid sirens began their metallic wail across the sleeping city just before midnight. In the Shiramachi district, where wooden houses pressed against one another like dominoes awaiting a careless hand, Mrs. Fumiko Yamada pulled her children closer beneath a thin cotton blanket. The temperature had dropped to 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and frost had begun to crystallize on the paper screens of her home. She could hear the distant rumble, a sound like summer thunder, but wrong, mechanical, growing steadily louder. Above the city, at precisely 8,000 feet, Major Thomas Power sat in the lead Pathfinder B-29 Superfortress, watching the sprawling darkness of Tokyo unfold beneath him like a vast black ocean punctuated by pinpricks of light. His hands were steady on the controls, but his mouth had gone dry. Behind him, in a stream stretching back 30 miles across the Pacific night, 334 B-29 bombers followed in a procession of aluminum and purpose, each aircraft carrying something the Japanese defenders had never encountered in such concentration. Not the usual high-explosive bombs, not the blockbusters that cratered streets and toppled concrete, but canisters filled with gelid gasoline, magnesium, white phosphorus, and napalm. The firebombs, 6 pounds each, clustered by the hundreds into a single container designed to burst at 2,000 feet and scatter its contents across a quarter-mile radius like seeds of destruction. The bombardiers had been briefed for weeks. They knew their targets by heart. The densely packed residential and light industrial zones where Tokyo's war production had been dispersed into thousands of small workshops, cottage industries, and family-run facilities that turned out ball bearings, radio parts, aircraft components, and ammunition in buildings made almost entirely of wood and paper. The first Pathfinder aircraft released its load at 12:08 a.m. on March 10th. The incendiary clusters tumbled through the freezing air, whistling as they fell, and then burst open with a sound like cloth tearing. Hundreds of individual firebombs scattered across Shiramachi, striking rooftops, streets, gardens, and temples. They ignited on impact, with a flash of white brilliance that turned night into noon for a fraction of a second, then settled into a fierce orange burn that could not be extinguished with water. The gelid gasoline clung to whatever it touched, wood, fabric, human skin, and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires had begun. Within an hour, those fires had merged into something unprecedented in the history of warfare, a firestorm. The concept of strategic bombing had evolved throughout the war, shaped by theories that predated the conflict and refined by years of trial, error, and escalation. In the beginning, military planners on all sides had imagined aerial bombardment as a precision instrument, surgical strikes against factories, bridges, rail yards, and military installations that would cripple an enemy's capacity to wage war while sparing civilian populations. The reality had proven far more complex and far more brutal. The Germans had bombed Rotterdam and Coventry. The British had retaliated with Hamburg and Dresden. The Americans, committed initially to daylight precision bombing in Europe, had discovered that weather, mechanical failure, and human error rendered true precision nearly impossible, even under optimal conditions. By early 1945, the distinction between military and civilian targets had blurred into irrelevance in the minds of strategists who measured success, not in individual factories destroyed, but in aggregate industrial capacity degraded, not in enemy soldiers killed, but in national will to fight eroded. Japan presented unique challenges that further complicated the moral and tactical calculus of strategic bombing. Unlike Germany, where major industries concentrated in large factories that could be identified and targeted from altitude, Japanese war production had been deliberately dispersed throughout urban areas in response to the American submarine blockade that had strangled raw material imports. Small workshops employing a dozen workers operated out of residential neighborhoods. Women and children assembled fuses and shell casings in their homes. The line between combatant and non-combatant, between military target and civilian population, had been erased not by American targeting policy, but by Japanese industrial strategy. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the Roman 21 Bomber Command, had arrived in the Mariana Islands in January 1945, with orders to increase the effectiveness of the bombing campaign against Japan's home islands. A veteran of the European theater, LeMay had observed the results of area incendiary attacks on German cities, and recognized that Japan's wood and paper architecture made it uniquely vulnerable to fire. His predecessors had attempted high-altitude precision bombing, but the jet stream winds above Japan scattered bomb patterns so widely that accuracy became meaningless. LeMay made a decision that would define his legacy and haunt his conscience for the remainder of his life. He would send his bombers in at night, at low altitude, stripped of most defensive armament to increase bomb load, and they would carry nothing but incendiaries. They would burn Japan's cities to ash. The crews who flew those missions understood the mathematics of what they were doing, even if they tried not to dwell on the human calculus. Each M69 incendiary bomb weighed 6 pounds and burned for approximately 6 minutes, hot enough to ignite wood on contact. Each cluster contained 48 individual bombs. Each bomber carried approximately 40 clusters. Each mission involved hundreds of bombers. The arithmetic led to conclusions that were easier to express in tons of ordnance delivered or square miles of urban area destroyed than in individual human lives consumed by fire. But the pilots and bombardiers were not machines, and some among them wrestled with questions that had no comfortable answers. Was this strategic necessity or war crime? Was there a meaningful difference when the outcome was the same? Could the deliberate incineration of civilian populations ever be justified by the argument that it shortened the war, and thus saved lives in aggregate? The men who flew over Tokyo that night carried these questions with them into the darkness, along with their payload of fire. Lieutenant Takeo Watanabe of the Japanese 10th Air Division sat in his Nakajima Ki-84 fighter on the runway at Chofu Airfield as the air raid sirens wailed across western Tokyo. He was 23 years old, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines, and he had shot down 6 American aircraft in aerial combat. His hands trembled slightly as he strapped on his flight helmet, not from fear, he told himself, but from the cold. The orders had come down from command. All available fighters were to scramble and intercept the American bomber stream. Standard procedure. Watanabe had flown dozens of interception missions against B-29s over the past 4 months. He knew the routine. Climb to altitude, position yourself above the bomber formation if possible, dive through their defensive fire, aim for the engines or cockpit, break away before the tail gunners could draw a bead on you, and climb back for another pass. It was dangerous work. The B-29s bristled with .50 caliber machine guns and flew in formations designed for mutual defense, but it was the work of a fighter pilot, and Watanabe had been trained since adolescence to accept death as the natural price of duty. As his engine roared to life and he taxied toward the runway, Watanabe glanced east toward the city center. Even from 15 miles away, he could see an orange glow beginning to stain the horizon. Odd, he thought. The raid had begun only minutes ago, far too soon for fires to be visible at this distance. The glow was expanding as he watched, spreading north and south along the horizon like a false dawn. He pushed the throttle forward, and his fighter leapt into the night sky, climbing steeply toward the sound of engines that filled the darkness above Tokyo like the droning of mechanical locusts. What Lieutenant Watanabe expected to encounter was a high-altitude bombing raid similar to those he had defended against throughout the winter. B-29s at 25,000 feet or higher, flying in tight defensive formations, releasing their bombs in concentrated patterns aimed at specific industrial targets. What he actually encountered, as he climbed through 8,000 feet, was a scene from a nightmare that his training had not prepared him to process. The American bombers were everywhere, and they were low, far lower than he had ever seen B-29s operate over Japan. They were coming in at staggered altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, flying individually rather than in formations, and they seemed to fill the entire sky over Tokyo. Watanabe counted a dozen aircraft within his immediate field of vision, and he could see the contrails and navigation lights of dozens more beyond them, a vast procession of bombers that stretched from horizon to horizon. The low altitude meant they were making themselves vulnerable to fighters and anti-aircraft fire, but it also meant their bombing accuracy would be far greater, and the sheer number of aircraft suggested this was not a raid aimed at a specific target, but an assault on the city itself. Below him, Tokyo was transforming into an inferno, unlike anything Watanabe had witnessed from the air. The individual fires had merged into a single vast conflagration that painted the clouds orange and red, and sent up columns of smoke so thick and high that Watanabe could see them rising past his altitude, black pillars ascending into the stratosphere. The heat from the fires was creating its own weather system, violent updrafts and downdrafts that buffeted his fighter like a toy and made stable flight impossible. The smell of burning wood and something else, something organic and terrible, penetrated even the enclosed cockpit. Watanabe realized with a shock of horror that he was smelling burning human flesh on a mass scale, the collective incineration of thousands of people carried aloft on superheated air currents. He selected a target, a B-29 flying straight and level at 7,000 feet, silhouetted against the flames below, and dove to attack. As he closed to firing range, he could see that the bomber's gun turrets were unmanned, the positions empty. The Americans had removed their defensive weapons to carry more incendiaries. They were so confident in the devastation they were inflicting that they had voluntarily made themselves defenseless. The realization filled Watanabe with a complex emotion that mixed rage, shame, and something close to despair. He thumbed the firing button, and his 20mm cannons roared, tracer rounds arcing toward the American bomber. He saw his shells strike the fuselage and wing, bright sparks against dark metal, but the B-29 did not falter. It continued on its bombing run as if his attack were nothing more than an insect bite, released its cluster of incendiaries into the maelstrom below, then banked leisurely to the southwest and headed back toward the Pacific. Watanabe pulled up from his attack run and climbed, searching for another target, but the updrafts from the firestorm threw his aircraft into a violent spin. He wrestled with the controls, fighting to regain stable flight, and when he finally leveled out at 10,000 feet, he made the mistake of looking directly down at the city beneath him. What he saw would remain seared into his memory for the rest of his life, as permanent and inescapable as a brand burned into flesh. Tokyo was being erased. The firestorm had grown to encompass more than 15 square miles of the city's most densely populated districts, a roughly rectangular zone of absolute destruction bordered by rivers on three sides. Within that zone, nothing remained but fire. The individual streets and buildings that Watanabe had known since childhood had vanished, consumed by a single continuous sea of flame that burned with such intensity that he could see the updrafts creating whirlwinds of fire, tornadoes of superheated air that lifted burning debris hundreds of feet into the sky and scattered it across surrounding neighborhoods, spreading the destruction outward in an ever-expanding circle. The thermal currents were so powerful that they were affecting the American bombers as they made their runs over the target area. Watanabe watched as a B-29 flying at 6,000 feet was caught by an updraft and thrown upward nearly 1,000 feet in seconds, the bomber tumbling like a leaf in a gale before its pilot regained control. The fires below were burning so hot that they were consuming the oxygen in the air above them, creating a vacuum that sucked in winds from all directions at ground level, winds so powerful that they tore roofs from buildings and lifted people off their feet and carried them into the flames. The Americans had not simply bombed Tokyo, they had transformed the physics of the city itself into a killing mechanism, turned the air and heat and wind into weapons as lethal as any explosive. Watanabe made 3 more attack runs against American bombers that night. His guns damaged at least 2 aircraft that he could confirm, possibly a third. He did not claim any kills. It did not seem to matter. For every bomber he attacked, 20 more continued their runs unmolested. The anti-aircraft batteries scattered throughout Tokyo had fallen silent, their crews either dead or fled, and the few other Japanese fighters Watanabe saw in the air seemed as overwhelmed and purposeless as he felt. They were not defending the city. They were bearing witness to its destruction, impotent observers of an apocalypse conducted with industrial efficiency by an enemy whose material superiority had rendered Japanese courage and sacrifice irrelevant. At 2:30 a.m., with his fuel running low and his ammunition exhausted, Watanabe turned west toward Chafu Airfield. As he flew away from the burning city, he passed over neighborhoods that were still intact, still sleeping, still populated by people who did not yet know that the world had changed in the past 2 hours. He wondered how many of them would be alive at dawn. He wondered if he would be alive at dawn. He wondered if Japan itself would be alive as a nation, as a culture, as anything more than a burned-out shell awaiting final conquest. The questions had no answers that he could formulate, so he focused on the mechanical task of landing his aircraft, taxiing to his revetment, shutting down the engine. When he climbed out of the cockpit, His legs nearly gave way beneath him. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. The ground crew who approached him looked at his face and stopped, uncertain, and Watanabe realized that he was crying. He had not noticed. The historical record of what occurred in Tokyo during the early hours of March 10, 1945, is preserved in military after-action reports, survivor testimonies, photographic evidence, and the carefully compiled statistics that transform human tragedy into administrative data. 334 B-29 bombers participated in the raid. They dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo in the span of approximately 2.5 hours. The attack created a firestorm that consumed nearly 16 square miles of the city's most densely populated residential and light industrial districts. Post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey estimated that approximately 100,000 people died that night, though the true number may have been significantly higher given the transient population of refugees and workers whose presence in Tokyo was not officially recorded. Another 1 million people were rendered homeless. The number of injured survivors exceeded 100,000, many with burns so severe that they would die in the following days and weeks from infection and organ failure. The temperatures within the firestorm reached levels that exceeded any measurement tools available at the time. Survivor accounts describe glass melting in window frames, metal street fixtures sagging and flowing like wax, and water in fire cisterns boiling away to steam. The canals that crisscrossed Shiramachi, traditionally places of refuge during fires, became traps filled with boiling water and scalding steam that cooked people alive. Many who sought shelter by immersing themselves in the canals drowned when the crush of bodies created a packed mass of the dying and the dead through which escape became impossible. The heat was so intense that it created its own weather system, a ring of inrushing winds at ground level feeding the firestorm's appetite for oxygen, winds powerful enough to uproot trees and overturn vehicles, winds that carried burning embers for miles beyond the main fire zone and started hundreds of secondary fires throughout the city. The survivors spoke of a sound that accompanied the firestorm, a roar like nothing they had experienced before, deeper and more primal than any storm, more encompassing than ocean waves, a continuous thunder that seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than from the sky. It was the sound of a city burning, of hundreds of thousands of wooden structures igniting simultaneously, of superheated air expanding and rushing and creating pressure waves that could be felt in the bones. Some survivors described a moment when the roar reached a crescendo and the entire sky seemed to be on fire, when the flames rose so high that they blotted out the stars, and the smoke clouds above the city glowed red and orange from the reflected light of the inferno below, creating an artificial dome of fire that turned night into a hellish parody of daylight. Mrs. Fumiko Yamada survived that night, though she would carry the scars for the remainder of her life. When the firebombs began falling on her neighborhood, she grabbed her 2 children, a daughter of 7 and a son of 4, and fled her house into the street. All around her, other families were doing the same, streaming from their houses in night clothes, carrying whatever they could grab in the seconds before the flames made escape impossible. The street filled with people, a river of humanity flowing in no particular direction, because every direction seemed equally engulfed in fire. Mrs. Yamada ran north, then east when the flames blocked her path, then south, then west, her route determined not by any planned escape but by the momentary gaps in the wall of fire that surrounded her. She lost her son first, torn from her grasp by the press of bodies and the buffeting wind, his hand slipping from hers, his face turning back toward her for one instant before he disappeared into the crowd and the smoke. She screamed his name until her voice gave out, but there was no possibility of searching for him, no possibility of anything but continuing to run, because to stop moving was to die. She lost consciousness at some point, the smoke and heat and exhaustion overwhelming her, and when she woke, she was lying on the eastern bank of the Sumida River in a park that had somehow escaped the worst of the flames. Her daughter was beside her, unconscious but breathing. Mrs. Yamada's hands and face were covered with burns, her hair singed away, her nightclothes charred to rags. Around her, thousands of other survivors lay scattered across the park, some injured, some simply exhausted, some dying quietly in the grey light of dawn. The city beyond the river was gone. Where there had been neighborhoods and shops and temples and schools, There was now only ash and the skeletal remains of buildings, the occasional wall or chimney standing isolated in a landscape of devastation that stretched to the horizon. The fires were still burning in places, scattered flames feeding on whatever debris remained, sending up columns of black smoke that merged into a vast dark cloud that hung over Tokyo like a shroud. Mrs. Yamada's son was never found. She searched for him in the following weeks, walking through the temporary morgues and displaced persons camps that sprang up around the burned zone, examining bodies and questioning survivors, but he had simply vanished into the inferno along with tens of thousands of others whose remains were burned beyond recognition or buried under collapsed buildings or simply vaporized by the intensity of the heat. She eventually concluded that he had died in the first minutes of the firestorm, overcome by smoke or crushed in the stampede or consumed by the flames. She told herself that his death had been quick, that he had not suffered, though she had no way of knowing if this was true. The lies we tell ourselves about death are sometimes the only way we can continue living. The Japanese government suppressed information about the true scale of the destruction for weeks after the raid, issuing bland official statements that acknowledged an air attack on Tokyo but provided no details about casualties or damage. The military censors who controlled all media in Japan during the war years had standing instructions to minimize reports of bombing damage to preserve civilian morale and prevent the Americans from assessing the effectiveness of their attacks. But the reality of what had happened to Tokyo could not be hidden from those who lived in the city or had family there. Within days, the truth had spread throughout Japan by word of mouth, carried by refugees who had fled the ruins, and by soldiers on leave who passed through the capital and saw the devastation firsthand. The psychological impact of the firebombing on the Japanese population was profound and multi-layered. On one level, it generated a surge of hatred toward the Americans and renewed calls for resistance to the bitter end. The attack was characterized in propaganda as evidence of American barbarity and proof that surrender would mean extermination. But on a deeper level, the raid shadowed the carefully cultivated narrative that Japanese spiritual superiority and willingness to sacrifice would overcome American material advantage. The firebombing demonstrated with undeniable clarity that modern industrial warfare rewarded production capacity and technological sophistication, not courage or devotion. Japan's warrior ethos, its emphasis on individual heroism and acceptance of death, had been rendered obsolete by an enemy who could burn a city to ash in a single night without losing a single bomber to enemy action. Lieutenant Takeo Watanabe flew 4 more interception missions against American bombers in the weeks following the Tokyo raid. He shot down 1 B-29, confirmed and damaged several others. The victories brought him no satisfaction. In his diary, fragments of which survived the war and were later published, he wrote with increasing desperation about the futility of Japan's continued resistance. "We are fighting with swords against machines," he wrote on March 20, 1945. "Our courage means nothing to an enemy who fights from above the clouds and burns our cities while we sleep. We are told that our spirit will prevail, but I have seen spirit burn like paper in the firestorm. I no longer know what we are defending or why. The war is lost. Everyone with eyes can see it. But we continue to fight, because to admit defeat would mean acknowledging that all the deaths, all the sacrifices, all the suffering were for nothing. So we will fight until nothing remains, until the last city burns, until the last soldier dies, and we will call it honor." Watanabe's growing disillusionment reflected a broader crisis of confidence that was spreading through the Japanese military in the spring of 1945. The strategic situation had become hopeless by any objective measure. American forces had captured Iwo Jima in March and were preparing to invade Okinawa in April. The American submarine blockade had strangled Japanese shipping to the point where fuel and raw materials for war production had become critically scarce. The Soviet Union, which had maintained neutrality in the Pacific War, was showing signs of preparing to enter the conflict against Japan. And most devastatingly, the American bombing campaign was systematically destroying Japan's cities and industrial capacity. After the success of the Tokyo raid, General LeMay ordered similar firebombing attacks on Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and every other major city in Japan. By June 1945, more than 40% of Japan's urban area had been destroyed. Millions of people had been killed or rendered homeless. War production had declined precipitously, not because the factories had been destroyed, though many had, but because the workers who staffed them were dead or displaced or so demoralized by malnutrition and constant fear of air attack that productivity had collapsed. The Japanese military leadership faced a dilemma that had no satisfactory solution. They could see that the war was lost, but the warrior culture that had shaped their worldview made the concept of surrender almost unthinkable. Surrender meant dishonor, betrayal of the emperor, abandonment of the millions who had already died for the nation. The alternative, fighting to the last man, woman, and child in a final apocalyptic defense of the home islands, promised only a different species of annihilation. Caught between these unacceptable options, the leadership did what bureaucracies often do when faced with impossible choices. They delayed, debated, split into factions, and allowed events to overtake them. Meetings of the Supreme War Council devolved into circular arguments between those who advocated immediate surrender to prevent further destruction, and those who insisted that continued resistance might still extract concessions from the Allies or at least preserve some shred of national honor. The debates continued through April, through May, through June, while American bombers turned Japanese cities into ash and the death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands. The Tokyo firebombing of March 9-10, 1945, represents a watershed moment in the evolution of modern warfare, a point at which the industrial capacity to inflict mass death had so far outpaced the moral and legal frameworks designed to constrain violence that the very concept of war crimes became nearly meaningless. The raid killed more people in a single night than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima would kill 5 months later, yet it has received far less attention in historical memory and generated far less moral debate. Perhaps this is because the firebombing was incremental rather than revolutionary, a larger-scale version of tactics already employed against dozens of other cities, rather than a fundamentally new form of destruction. Perhaps it is because the atomic bombs ended the war, giving them historical weight that overshadows everything that came before. Or perhaps it is because acknowledging the moral implications of the firebombing requires confronting uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice in wartime, questions that resist easy answers. Was the Tokyo raid a war crime? By the standards articulated at the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals that followed the war, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations for the purpose of terrorizing them into submission or destroying enemy morale constitutes a violation of the laws of war. Yet the tribunals exempted Allied bombing campaigns from this standard, arguing that attacks on cities with mixed military and civilian character were legitimate if they served a genuine strategic purpose. The distinction is more rhetorical than substantive. The firebombing of Tokyo was no more strategically necessary than the bombing of Dresden or Hamburg, and infinitely less discriminate. The Americans could have continued their campaign against Japanese military facilities, transportation infrastructure, and heavy industry without deliberately incinerating residential neighborhoods. The choice to target civilians was made consciously, with full knowledge of the likely casualties, and justified on grounds that destroying enemy morale and war production capacity, even when that production was dispersed among civilian populations, served the ultimate goal of ending the war. This justification rests on a utilitarian calculus. The firebombing campaign, by demonstrating Japan's helplessness in the face of American air power and degrading its capacity to resist, shortened the war and thus saved lives that would have been lost in a prolonged conflict and invasion of the home islands. The arithmetic is theoretically sound but morally fraught. It requires placing a precise numerical value on human life. How many Japanese civilians burned to death equals how many American soldiers killed in an invasion. How many months of continued war justifies how many thousands of tons of incendiaries dropped on residential neighborhoods. The calculation assumes that the bombing campaign did in fact meaningfully contribute to Japan's surrender, an assumption that historians continue to debate. And most troublingly, it establishes a precedent that any level of civilian casualties can be justified if they serve a strategic purpose defined by the attacking power, a standard that, applied universally, would render the concept of war crimes nearly toothless. General Curtis LeMay, who planned and ordered the firebombing campaign, understood the moral ambiguity of his actions. In his memoirs and interviews conducted decades after the war, he acknowledged that if the United States had lost the war, he would likely have been prosecuted as a war criminal. "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal," he said in a 1965 interview. "Fortunately, we were on the winning side." The statement is often quoted as evidence of cynicism or moral flexibility, but it can also be read as a rare moment of honesty about the nature of wartime justice, that the legal and moral evaluation of violence is determined not by universal principles, but by power and victory. LeMay never expressed public regret for the firebombing campaign, consistently defending it as a necessary measure that saved American lives by compelling Japanese surrender. Whether he wrestled with private doubts about the morality of burning tens of thousands of civilians alive is a question to which only he knew the answer. The symbolism of fire as the weapon of choice against Japan carries its own complex freight of meaning. Fire is perhaps the most primal of human fears, etched into our evolutionary memory from the millennia before we learned to control it. It is personal and intimate in a way that high-explosive bombs are not. A shell or bomb kills by concussion and fragmentation, violent but abstract, while fire consumes, transforming its victims slowly and agonizingly. The choice to use incendiary weapons against Japanese cities was made on practical grounds. Japan's wood and paper architecture made fire far more effective than high explosives, but the symbolic resonance cannot be ignored. Fire is associated with purification, with cleansing, with the destruction of impurity. To burn something is to erase it utterly, to reduce it to ash and memory. The firebombing campaign was not merely an attack on Japan's capacity to wage war. It was an assault on the physical manifestation of Japanese culture, the destruction of the built environment in which that culture existed. The ancient temples, the traditional neighborhoods, the wooden houses that had sheltered families for generations, all of it burned together with the war production facilities and military barracks, transformed into undifferentiated ash. For the Japanese pilots who attempted to defend against the firebombing raids, the psychological impact was devastating in ways that transcended the immediate military situation. They had been raised in a culture that venerated the warrior, that taught them from childhood that courage and skill and willingness to sacrifice could overcome any material disadvantage. They had absorbed the myths of samurai heroes who defeated superior forces through superior spirit, stories of legendary swordsmen who never tasted defeat because their souls were perfectly aligned with the cosmic order. These myths had been repurposed by Japanese militarism to justify aggression and sustain morale, transformed from historical narratives into ideological imperatives. The pilots who flew against the B-29s over Tokyo believed, because they had been taught to believe, that their dedication and courage mattered, that individual heroism could influence the course of the war, that death in battle would purchase something of value even if the battle itself was lost. The reality they confronted over the burning city shattered these beliefs with brutal finality. The American bombers came in such numbers that intercepting them made no meaningful difference. They flew so low and carried so few defensive weapons that attacking them felt less like combat than like a training exercise. And the destruction they inflicted was so overwhelming, so total, that the very concept of defense became absurd. What did it mean to defend a city that was being erased from existence even as you flew above it? How could courage or skill matter when the enemy's material superiority was so absolute that they could burn 16 square miles of urban area in 2 hours without losing a single aircraft to your defenses? The experience was not merely one of military defeat, but of ontological collapse. The discovery that everything you had been taught about the nature of warfare, honor, and meaning was a lie, or at least a truth that had been rendered obsolete by industrial modernity. Lieutenant Watanabe wrote in his diary on March 15, 1945, "I flew over the burned zone today in daylight. Nothing remains. Where there were houses and shops and people living their lives, there is only ash. You can see the outlines of streets, because the ash is deeper where buildings stood. In some places, you can still see the shapes of bodies. Shadows burned into the ground where people fell, and the fire consumed them. From the air, it looks like a map of hell drawn by a madman. I tried to count the bodies I could see, but I stopped when I reached 100. There were thousands more, perhaps tens of thousands, and this was only one part of the city. How many more died where the ash is too deep to see them? How many burned completely away, leaving nothing at all? I have stopped thinking of them as individuals. It is the only way to stay sane. They are numbers now, statistics, data points in the calculus of defeat. But I remember that each number was a person who woke up that morning, not knowing they would burn to death before midnight. Each one had a name, a family, a life. The Americans who dropped the bombs, do they think about this? Do they know what they have done? Or do they only see targets and tonnage and mission objectives? I do not know which answer would be worse. The American bomber crews who flew the Tokyo mission struggled with their own psychological aftermath of the raid, though their experience was necessarily different from that of the defenders. They had not witnessed the raid from within the inferno but from above it, protected by altitude and distance, and the aluminum skin of their aircraft. What they saw was apocalyptic but abstract, a sea of fire spreading beneath them, smoke columns rising to their altitude and beyond, the city transformed into a luminous grid of orange and red that cast enough light to read by inside the bomber cabins. Many crew members later described a cognitive dissonance between the visual spectacle of the raid and the knowledge of what the spectacle represented. It was beautiful in a terrible way. The colors, the scale, the sheer magnitude of the destruction. Some crew members took photographs, documenting what they were witnessing not as a war crime, but as a historical moment, proof that they had participated in something unprecedented. The moral reckoning came later, for some immediately and for others only after years or decades had provided distance and context. Radio operator Robert Landers, who flew in the Tokyo raid as part of a B-29 crew, described in a 1985 interview the moment when the reality of what they had done penetrated the professional detachment that combat flying required. When we debriefed after the mission, the intelligence officers told us that we had probably killed more people in one night than any other aerial attack in history. They said it like it was an accomplishment, something to be proud of, and in a way I suppose it was. We had executed our mission perfectly, destroyed our targets, returned all our aircraft safely. But that night, lying in my bunk, I couldn't stop thinking about what killed more people than any other aerial attack in history actually meant. I imagined a city full of people like the people I had grown up with, families eating dinner, children doing homework, old people sleeping, and then the bombs falling and the fires starting and all those people burning alive. Hundreds of thousands of them, and I had helped do it. I had sat at my radio set and done my job and played my small part in incinerating a city. For years afterward, I told myself that it was necessary, that it shortened the war, that it saved American lives. And maybe all that is true, but it doesn't change what we did. It doesn't bring back the people we burned. The question of necessity, whether the firebombing campaign was required to achieve American strategic objectives, remains contested among historians. Proponents of the campaign argue that it destroyed Japan's war production capacity, demoralized the civilian population, and demonstrated to the Japanese leadership that continued resistance would result only in further destruction. They point to Japan's eventual surrender and argue that the bombing campaign, along with the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, provided the decisive motivation for the emperor to override the military factions that wanted to fight on. Critics counter that Japan was already defeated by the spring of 1945, its military shattered, its economy strangled by the submarine blockade, its capacity to threaten American interests essentially eliminated. They argue that the surrender could have been achieved through diplomatic means, particularly if the United States had been willing to guarantee the preservation of the imperial system, the primary concern of the Japanese leadership. The firebombing campaign in this interpretation was not strategically necessary, but rather a demonstration of American power and a preview of the total war capability that would define the post-war era. The historical evidence supports both interpretations to some degree, which suggests that the reality was more complex than either simple narrative allows. Japan was indeed defeated in any conventional military sense by March 1945, but its leadership had given no indication of willingness to surrender unconditionally, and elements within the military were actively preparing for a final apocalyptic defense of the home islands that would have inflicted catastrophic casualties on both sides. The atomic bombs that followed the firebombing campaign in August 1945 are often credited with forcing Japan's surrender, but the decision to surrender was influenced by multiple factors, the Soviet declaration of war against Japan on August 8, the Emperor's personal intervention, the exhaustion of the civilian population, and the cumulative effect of months of conventional and incendiary bombing that had reduced Japan's cities to ruins. The firebombing campaign was a necessary component of Japan's defeat in the sense that it contributed to the overall pressure that eventually forced surrender. But whether it was necessary in the sense of being the only or best means to achieve that end is a question that cannot be definitively answered. What can be stated with certainty is that the Tokyo firebombing and the campaign of which it was a part represented a fundamental shift in the character of modern warfare. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants, between military and civilian targets, had been under pressure throughout the war as all belligerents expanded their definition of legitimate targets to include enemy morale, industrial capacity, and economic infrastructure. The firebombing campaign pushed this erosion to its logical extreme. If the objective is to destroy the enemy's capacity and will to make war, and if that capacity and will are distributed among the entire population, then the entire population becomes a legitimate target. This logic, once accepted, has no inherent limiting principle. It can justify any level of violence against any population, provided that the violence serves some definable strategic objective. The firebombing of Tokyo did not introduce this logic. It was already implicit in the area bombing of German cities and in Japan's own atrocities in China and elsewhere, but it demonstrated the logic's ultimate implications with unprecedented clarity. The burned zone in Tokyo remained largely empty for years after the war, a 16-square-mile scar on the city's geography that resisted immediate reconstruction. The ash had buried the rubble to such depth that clearing it for rebuilding required enormous labor. The soil itself was contaminated with the residue of tens of thousands of burned bodies and the chemical components of incendiary bombs. Survivors spoke of the smell that lingered over the area for months, sweet and acrid, the scent of death on a mass scale. When reconstruction finally began in the late 1940s, it proceeded slowly, hampered by the shortage of materials and the broader economic devastation of post-war Japan. The new buildings that rose on the ruins bore no resemblance to the traditional wooden structures they replaced. They were concrete and steel, modern and functional, designed to resist fire and earthquake. The old Tokyo, the city of wood and paper that had evolved organically over centuries, was gone. In its place, a new city emerged, one that looked to the future rather than the past, that embraced American architectural styles and urban planning principles, that sought to forget the trauma of fire and defeat by rebuilding itself in the image of modernity. Mrs. Fumiko Yamada lived until 1987, dying at the age of 73. She never remarried after her husband was killed in the Philippines in 1944. She raised her surviving daughter in a small apartment in a rebuilt section of Tokyo, working as a seamstress and later as a clerk in a department store. She rarely spoke about the night of March 10, 1945, even to her daughter, but on the anniversary of the firebombing each year, she would visit the memorial that had been erected at Yokomicho Park, where she had regained consciousness on that terrible morning. She would stand before the memorial for an hour or more, silent, her face expressionless, and then she would return home and resume her life. Her daughter, interviewed decades later as part of an oral history project, said that her mother had carried a small photograph of her lost son in her purse every day for the rest of her life, though she never displayed it and never mentioned it. When Mrs. Yamada died, the photograph was found among her possessions, a formal portrait of a 4-year-old boy in a traditional kimono, taken at a shrine festival in the autumn of 1944. On the back of the photograph, in her mother's handwriting, Kenji, born April 12, 1940, lost March 10, 1945, not forgotten. Lieutenant Takeo Watanabe survived the war. He was not called upon to fly a kamikaze mission, though he had volunteered for such duty in July 1945. The war ended before his name came to the top of the list. After demobilization, he returned to his family home in rural Kyushu and attempted to resume civilian life. He married in 1948 and worked as a schoolteacher, instructing children in mathematics and science. He never flew an aircraft again. In his later years, he became active in peace education, visiting schools to speak about his experiences in the war and to advocate for the abolition of nuclear weapons and the peaceful resolution of international conflicts. He died in 2003 at the age of 81. In one of his final interviews, conducted in 2001, he reflected on the night of the Tokyo firebombing. "I have tried to make sense of that night for 56 years. I have read books and studied history and talked to other veterans and survivors. I understand the strategic logic of what the Americans did. I understand that war creates its own morality, that survival justifies actions that would be unthinkable in peacetime. But understanding does not equal acceptance. I saw a city burn. I saw hundreds of thousands of people incinerated. I saw the future. A future in which technology has given us the power to destroy on a scale that our ethics and wisdom have not evolved to manage. That night over Tokyo was not an aberration. It was a preview. Hiroshima and Nagasaki came next, and then the hydrogen bomb, and now we have weapons that could end human civilization in an afternoon. We have built machines of destruction that dwarf anything the gods of myth could command, and we tell ourselves that possessing these weapons keeps us safe. But I remember the smell of Tokyo burning. I remember the futility of trying to defend against an enemy whose material power was so vast that our courage meant nothing. And I know that if we ever use these weapons on a large scale, there will be no victors, no defeated, no one left to write the history books or conduct the interviews or debate the morality of what was done. There will only be ash and silence, and the end of everything we have built over millennia. That is what I learned over Tokyo in 1945. That is the lesson I have tried to teach for the past half-century. I fear it is a lesson we will have to learn again before we truly understand it. The legacy of the Tokyo firebombing is preserved in statistics and memorials, in survivor testimonies and academic studies, in museums and history books that document what happened on that night in March 1945. But the true weight of the event, its meaning and moral implications, remains unsettled and perhaps unsettlable. It was a strategic victory for the United States, a demonstration of air power that contributed to Japan's eventual surrender. It was also a moral catastrophe, the deliberate incineration of a civilian population on a scale that challenges our capacity to comprehend mass death. It was an act of war conducted according to the logic of total war, a logic that the United States helped to define and perfect. It was a crime against humanity by any reasonable moral standard, yet it has never been officially classified as such because the victors write the rules. All of these statements are simultaneously true, and the contradictions among them cannot be resolved except by acknowledging that modern warfare exists in a space beyond traditional moral categories, a space where the scale of violence has outpaced our ethical frameworks and left us with choices that have no good answers. The firebombing campaign against Japan continued after Tokyo. Nagoya was bombed on March 11-12, Osaka on March 13-14, Kobe on March 16-17. By the end of the war in August 1945, more than 60 Japanese cities had been subjected to incendiary attacks. The total death toll from the campaign exceeded 500,000 civilians, with millions more injured or displaced. The landscape of Japan was transformed. A nation of historic cities, traditional architecture, and cultural monuments had become a nation of rubble and ash, a blank slate on which the post-war order would be imposed. The reconstruction of Japan under American occupation proceeded according to principles that emphasized modernization, democratization, and economic development. The physical destruction of the war became a metaphor for cultural renewal. The old Japan had been burned away, and a new Japan would rise from the ashes, one that embraced democracy and capitalism and alliance with the United States. This narrative of destruction and renewal, of fire as purification, served the psychological needs of both the victors and the defeated. For Americans, it justified the bombing campaign by casting it as a necessary prelude to Japan's transformation from militaristic empire to peaceful ally. For the Japanese, it provided a framework for understanding their defeat not as a humiliation, but as a transition, a painful but ultimately beneficial destruction of a flawed system that allowed for the emergence of something better. The firebombing, in this interpretation, was not simply an act of violence, but a form of harsh instruction, a demonstration that Japan's militaristic path had been wrong, and that accommodation with American power was both inevitable and ultimately in Japan's best interest. But this narrative, convenient though it may be, does not withstand close examination. The firebombing campaign was not conducted with Japan's post-war welfare in mind. It was conducted to destroy Japan's capacity to resist and to demonstrate American power. The fact that Japan subsequently became a democratic, prosperous nation does not retroactively justify the incineration of hundreds of thousands of civilians, any more than economic development in post-war Germany justifies the Holocaust. The two things are simply not connected in a causal sense. Japan's post-war success was the result of specific occupation policies, economic circumstances, and choices made by Japanese leaders, not an inevitable outcome of having its cities burned to ash. The narrative of redemptive destruction is a post hoc rationalization, a way of making moral sense of actions that were driven by strategic calculation rather than ethical principle. The object that came to symbolize the Tokyo firebombing in the memories of survivors and in the historical consciousness of Japan was not a weapon or a piece of technology but something far simpler: an air raid shelter. Throughout Japan in 1945, neighborhood associations constructed rudimentary shelters designed to protect civilians during bombing raids. These shelters were usually nothing more than reinforced holes dug into the ground and covered with earth and sandbags. They were effective against blast effects from high-explosive bombs, but they were death traps during a firestorm. The superheated air that rushed into the shelters incinerated people without the flames even touching them. The carbon monoxide and other gases produced by the fires suffocated those who tried to wait out the raid underground. After the Tokyo firebombing, rescue workers found hundreds of shelters packed with corpses, families who had followed official instructions and sought protection only to die together in the darkness. The air raid shelter became a recurring image in post-war Japanese literature and film about the firebombing, a symbol of the inadequacy of official protection, of the false promises made by a government that could not actually defend its people, of the bitter irony that the measures taken to ensure survival often led directly to death. The shelters represented the gap between the narrative of resistance and sacrifice that the military government promoted and the reality of helplessness in the face of overwhelming force. They were physical manifestations of the lie that courage and proper behavior would ensure survival, when in fact survival was largely a matter of chance, of being in one location rather than another when the bombs began to fall, of making split-second decisions based on inadequate information in the chaos of a firestorm. Mrs. Yamada's decision to flee her house, rather than take shelter in the neighborhood air raid shelter, almost certainly saved her life. She made that choice on instinct, driven by a primal fear of being trapped, but had she followed official guidance and entered the shelter with her children, all three of them would likely have died. Her son, who was torn from her grasp in the street during the panic of evacuation, may have died because she made the choice to run. Had they sheltered in their house, they might have survived together, or they might all have died together. The contingency of survival, the arbitrary nature of who lived and who died, haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. There was no logic to it, no pattern that could be discerned and learned from. It was pure chance, and chance undermines meaning. We need to believe that our actions matter, that our choices have consequences, that we have some control over our fate. The firestorm taught the opposite lesson, that in the face of sufficient force, individual agency becomes irrelevant, and whether you live or die is determined by factors utterly beyond your control. This psychological impact, the learned helplessness, the recognition of powerlessness, was perhaps more devastating to Japanese national psychology than the physical destruction itself. The Japanese military culture that had dominated the nation for decades was predicated on the belief that willpower and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. This belief sustained Japanese soldiers through years of brutal combat in China, the Pacific Islands, and Southeast Asia. It justified enormous casualties and hardships by promising that endurance would eventually yield victory, or at least death with honor. The firebombing campaign demonstrated with brutal clarity that this belief was false. No amount of willpower could extinguish an incendiary bomb. No degree of sacrifice could shoot down hundreds of B-29s. The spiritual strength that Japan's leaders had promised would overcome American material wealth proved to be an illusion when confronted with the reality of industrial warfare conducted at scale. The post-war Japanese commitment to pacifism, enshrined in Article 9 of the Constitution imposed by American occupation authorities, can be understood partly as a response to this revelation. Having learned the hard way that military power deployed against a materially superior enemy leads to catastrophic defeat and destruction, post-war Japan chose a different path: economic development, diplomatic engagement, alignment with American power rather than opposition to it. This choice was pragmatic, but it was also philosophical, rooted in the trauma of the firebombing and the atomic attacks that followed. The lesson absorbed by many Japanese in 1945 was not, "We must become stronger militarily so we can never be defeated again," but rather, "We must never again find ourselves in a conflict with an enemy capable of this level of destruction." The pacifism was born from fear as much as principle, from the memory of fire and the knowledge that modern warfare had evolved to a point where defeat did not mean occupation, but annihilation. On March 10, 2025, the 80th anniversary of the Tokyo firebombing, fewer than 100 survivors of the raid remained alive. They are in their 80s and 90s now, the last living witnesses to a night that killed more people than any other air attack in history. Every year, their numbers diminish, and with them goes direct memory of what happened. Soon, the firebombing will pass entirely into history, known only through documents and photographs, and the testimonies that survivors left behind. The transition from lived experience to historical event is inevitable and necessary, but something is always lost in the translation. The statistics remain: 100,000 dead, 16 square miles destroyed, 2,000 tons of incendiaries dropped. But the meaning behind the statistics, the individual terror and pain and loss that each number represents, becomes harder to grasp with each passing year. Perhaps this is why survivors like Lieutenant Watanabe and Mrs. Yamada devoted so much effort in their later years to bearing witness, to telling their stories to anyone who would listen. They understood that once they were gone, the firebombing would become just another data point in the history of World War II, overshadowed by the atomic bombings and the larger narrative of Japan's defeat and transformation. They wanted future generations to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like, what it meant to watch a city burn, to lose everything in a single night, to survive when tens of thousands around you did not. They wanted their testimony to stand as a permanent reminder that war, however it is justified, whatever strategic objectives it serves, consists ultimately of individual human beings suffering and dying in ways that no amount of strategic logic can make acceptable. The epilogue to the Tokyo firebombing was written not in the days or weeks that followed, but in the decades of post-war history that shaped the relationship between Japan and the United States and redefined both nations' understanding of warfare and security. The intimacy of destruction created by the firebombing and the atomic attacks that followed was unprecedented. American military power had reached into the heart of Japanese society and touched virtually every family, every neighborhood, every city. The United States could have withdrawn after imposing surrender, leaving Japan to rebuild itself and potentially to nurture resentment and desire for revenge. Instead, the occupation authorities pursued a policy of engagement and reconstruction that rebuilt Japan's economy, reformed its political system, and transformed a defeated enemy into a close ally. This transformation was motivated partly by Cold War strategic considerations, the need for a strong ally in Asia to counter Soviet and Chinese communism, but it also reflected a recognition, perhaps subconscious, that the level of destruction inflicted on Japan had created a moral obligation to assist in its recovery. The relationship that emerged from the ashes of Tokyo and Hiroshima was complex and fraught with unresolved tensions. Japan became dependent on American security guarantees, sheltered under the nuclear umbrella that had incinerated two of its cities. The Japanese economy was integrated into an American-led international order, prospering through trade with the nation that had nearly destroyed it. Japanese culture absorbed American influences while struggling to maintain its distinctive identity. The contradictions were profound, but they were manageable because both nations chose to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. The firebombing was remembered in Japan, but not publicly blamed on Americans. The occupation was recalled in the United States as enlightened nation building, rather than victor's justice imposed on a devastated enemy. The narrative that both sides constructed was one of reconciliation and mutual benefit, and that narrative has largely held for 80 years. But beneath the surface of reconciliation, questions persist that have never been fully answered. Did the end of the war justify the means employed to achieve it? Does strategic necessity excuse moral transgression? Can the deliberate killing of civilians in large numbers ever be anything other than a war crime, regardless of the outcome? These questions have no comfortable answers, which is perhaps why they are rarely asked directly in official discourse between the United States and Japan. To interrogate the morality of the firebombing too closely would undermine the foundation of the post-war alliance. To acknowledge that American actions in 1945 crossed moral lines would require a reckoning that neither nation has shown any willingness to pursue. The symbolic significance of fire in human consciousness makes the firebombing particularly resonant as a historical event. Fire is transformative, irreversible, total. It does not merely damage, it erases. What burns cannot be fully recovered or reconstructed. At best, it can be replaced with something new. The Tokyo that rose from the ashes of March 10, 1945, was not the same city rebuilt, but a new city built on the site where the old city had been. The continuity of place remained, but the continuity of culture, architecture, and community was severed. In this sense, the firebombing achieved something beyond mere destruction of war production capacity or demoralization of the enemy. It broke historical continuity, created a rupture between past and present that could never be fully bridged. The Japan that existed before the firebombing and the Japan that emerged after were separated by an unbridgeable chasm of fire and ash and death. This rupture served American strategic interests in ways that conventional military defeat might not have. A Japan that had been defeated in battle but remained intact as a society could potentially have rebuilt its military capacity and sought to reverse its defeat. A Japan that had been so thoroughly destroyed that its entire urban landscape had to be reconstructed from scratch was forced to accept that the old ways had led to catastrophe and that survival required adaptation to a new order. The firebombing and atomic attacks did not merely defeat Japan militarily, they defeated the ideological and cultural foundations of Japanese militarism so thoroughly that reconstruction required a complete reorientation of national identity. This was not entirely intentional. The firebombing campaign was designed to destroy Japan's war-making capacity, not to transform its culture, but it was nonetheless the effect. The night sky over Tokyo on March 10, 1945, glowed with a light that could be seen for hundreds of miles, a dome of fire and smoke that transformed darkness into an eerie orange twilight. American bomber crews reported being able to read maps by the light of the city burning below them. Japanese civilians in rural areas dozens of miles from Tokyo saw the glow on the horizon and knew, without being told, that something unprecedented was occurring. The light from the firestorm was not merely physical illumination but symbolic revelation. It exposed the reality that Japan's military leaders had tried to conceal from the population, that the war was not only lost but that continued resistance meant nothing except further suffering, that the promised final victory was a fantasy, and the emperor's subjects were being burned alive while the army proved powerless to stop it. In the months that followed the Tokyo firebombing, American strategic bombing systematically attacked every major city in Japan except Kyoto, which was spared for cultural reasons at the insistence of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. By August 1945, Japan's urban areas had been reduced to ruins, its transportation network destroyed, its economy in collapse, its population malnourished and demoralized. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August represented a new order of magnitude in destructive power, but they were in many ways simply a technological refinement of the strategy of urban destruction that had been practiced for months with conventional incendiaries. The atomic bombs killed fewer people than the Tokyo firebombing, but they killed them with a single weapon delivered by a single aircraft, demonstrating that the United States could destroy an entire city whenever it chose without risking hundreds of bombers and thousands of airmen. The psychological impact of this revelation, that resistance would lead not to honorable death in battle, but to instant annihilation without warning or possibility of defense, was arguably as important as the physical destruction in compelling Japan's surrender. The shadow that the firebombing of Tokyo cast across the remainder of the 20th century extended far beyond Japan. It established precedents and demonstrated capabilities that would shape military doctrine and international relations throughout the Cold War and beyond. The willingness to inflict mass casualties on civilian populations in pursuit of strategic objectives, once demonstrated in World War II, became a standard component of nuclear deterrence theory. The apocalyptic imagery of burning cities became the central metaphor of Cold War fear, the nightmare scenario that strategic planners insisted they were working to prevent, even as they designed weapons systems specifically intended to create that scenario on a global scale. The firebombing of Tokyo was a preview of what nuclear war would mean, not targeted strikes against military installations, but the wholesale destruction of cities and the populations they contained. The lesson that emerged from the ashes of Tokyo and Hiroshima was that modern industrial nations possessed the technical capacity to destroy entire populations, but lacked any coherent moral framework for deciding when such destruction was justified or how it could be limited once begun. The laws of war that had evolved over centuries were predicated on assumptions about the scale and nature of violence that industrial technology had rendered obsolete. The principle of proportionality, that military action should be proportionate to the military objective sought, became nearly meaningless when a single raid could kill 100,000 people. The principle of discrimination, that combatants and non-combatants should be distinguished, and that direct attacks on civilians should be avoided, was systematically violated by all sides in World War II, and then codified as standard practice in nuclear deterrence doctrine. The prohibition against causing unnecessary suffering was irrelevant in an era when weapons existed that could vaporize entire cities. The firebombing forced a reckoning with these contradictions, or rather, it should have forced such a reckoning. In practice, the United States and other victorious powers chose to sidestep the moral questions by excluding their own conduct from the standards they applied to defeated enemies. The Tokyo and Nuremberg tribunals prosecuted Axis leaders for war crimes that included strategic bombing of civilian populations, but Allied bombing campaigns that killed far more civilians were excluded from scrutiny on the grounds that they served legitimate strategic purposes. The double standard was obvious and indefensible in principle, but it was politically necessary to maintain Allied unity and establish the legal framework that would govern the post-war international order. Justice, it turned out, was less important than stability, and stability required that the victors not be held to the same standards as the defeated. In the end, the Tokyo firebombing stands as a monument to the ambiguity and moral complexity of modern warfare. It was a military success that contributed to Allied victory in World War II. It was a humanitarian catastrophe that killed 100,000 civilians in a single night. It was a strategic innovation that demonstrated the potential of air power to decisively influence war outcomes. It was a war crime by any objective moral standard, though one that has never been prosecuted or officially acknowledged as such. It was necessary, or it was unnecessary, or it was somewhere in between, depending on which assumptions you accept about Japanese willingness to surrender and the likely casualties of alternative strategies. All of these statements are defensible. None of them fully captures the truth. What remains beyond argument and interpretation is the irreducible fact of what happened. Fire fell from the sky on a cold March night in 1945, and 100,000 people burned to death in their homes and streets, and a city was erased from the landscape, and the world was changed. The men who flew the bombers that night believed they were doing what was necessary to end a brutal war and save American lives. The men who tried to defend against the attack believed they were fulfilling their duty to protect their homeland. Both groups were caught in a system of violence that had escalated beyond anyone's control, a machine of destruction that fed on itself and generated its own logic and imperatives. Individual moral choice had become nearly irrelevant. The machinery of total war ground forward regardless of what any individual soldier or pilot believed or wanted. The outcome was determined not by courage or virtue, but by industrial capacity and technological sophistication, and the willingness to use them without restraint. The survivors of the Tokyo firebombing carried its lessons for the rest of their lives. Lessons about the fragility of civilization, the inadequacy of protection, the arbitrariness of survival, and the hollowness of the promises that leaders make about security and victory. They learned that modern warfare does not discriminate between soldier and civilian, between guilty and innocent, between those who support the war and those who merely try to endure it. They learned that fire consumes all equally, and that once unleashed, it cannot be controlled or contained. It burns until there is nothing left to burn. They learned that the experience of being burned alive or watching your loved ones burn is a trauma that never heals, a wound that remains open for decades, a memory that intrudes unbidden into quiet moments and refuses to be forgotten no matter how much time passes. And they learned, perhaps most devastatingly, that the destruction of everything they had known and everyone they had loved was not seen by their enemies as a tragedy, but as a statistic, a measure of mission success, proof that the strategic bombing campaign was working as designed. The dead were not mourned by those who killed them, but counted, quantified, entered into ledgers and after-action reports as evidence of effectiveness. This dehumanization, this reduction of individual lives to aggregate data, may be the most enduring legacy of the Tokyo firebombing, the demonstration that modern war has evolved to a scale where individual human suffering becomes literally impossible to comprehend, where 100,000 deaths in a single night is not a universe-shattering catastrophe, but a line item in a strategic assessment. The fire that consumed Tokyo on March 10, 1945, burned away more than buildings and lives. It burned away the illusion that warfare, however terrible, retained some connection to human scale and human meaning. In its place, it left only ash and numbers, and the knowledge that we have created tools of destruction so powerful that using them requires us to stop thinking of our enemies as human beings like ourselves. That more than any specific atrocity is the true horror revealed by the fire that lit the night sky over Tokyo 80 years ago. Not that we are capable of inflicting such suffering, but that we are capable of inflicting it, and then justifying it, recording it, and moving on as if nothing fundamental about human nature and human society had been revealed in the process. The bombers returned to their bases. The fires burned themselves out. The ash settled over the ruins, and the war continued, as wars do, until one side or the other could no longer bear to continue. That is the epilogue written in fire above Tokyo, that we have crossed a threshold from which there is no return, into a future where the complete destruction of cities and populations has become not an unthinkable atrocity, but a standard option in the strategic playbook, something to be carefully planned and efficiently executed, and then explained to future generations as a regrettable necessity. The light from the firestorm has faded, but the precedent it set burns on, illuminating a truth about power and morality that we have still not found the courage to fully confront.